Hello and welcome to Elite Dangerous Survivor. My name is Nathaniel Page and this is the third of my video diaries on the Survivor gamebook. In this particular update, what I'd like to talk to you about is combat. So I've had a couple of people asking me how combat works in gamebooks in general, and a few more asking me what my specific plans are for Survivor. I can answer the second question really easily. I don't have any specific plans for Survivor, and this is the main reason why I've introduced Prologue within the reward tiers, because what I'd like to do is to try a mini adventure with the readers quite early on, so I can try a few completely different systems for combat and gauge which of them is of the most interest to you, so I can then take that system and use it in the final book. It's very, very important to me to get combat right in Survivor. If it's too simple, it won't engage the reader enough. It'll be quite boring. If it's too complicated, you'll spend more time fighting the system than you will do actually fighting the enemies. So I need to try to find some middle ground in which most people are happy. There'll always be some people who would have preferred it simpler or more complex, but I need to engage as many people as I can. And then in addition to that, and this is the really hard part for me, I need to make it feel as though it's part of the Elite universe, because otherwise it's just any other gamebook, and it's meant to be an Elite dangerous gamebook. So with all that in mind, what I'm going to show you in this video is firstly how combat works in a very popular game series, Fighting Fantasy, and then show how I might take elements from Elite and introduce it into that to show how Elite could affect a gamebook's combat structure. I will emphasize my intention is not to take Fighting Fantasy and use that as my basis for it. All I want to do is to show how elements of Elite could be brought into a combat system within a gamebook. So, for the people who haven't played Fighting Fantasy before, here's how it works. I'm going to show you things on the computer screen because it's easier to do that than it is to do it on paper. On the left hand side of the grey line, you've got information about you, the reader, the player. On the right hand side of the line, you've got information about an enemy that you've encountered. Each of the fighters has two attributes, skill and stamina. Skill dictates your ability to hit the enemy with your sword, the higher the better, and then stamina dictates how much damage you can take before you die, before the game's over. Combat itself is resolved in a series of combat rounds. In each combat round, you roll 2 dice for yourself and add those to your skill score to give your attack strength. Then you do the same thing for the enemy. So in this particular case, the enemy's attack strength is 16, my attack strength is only 13, so the enemy has done 2 stamina points of damage to me because they've hit me. There's always 2 stamina points within Fighting Fantasy in the simplest of the combat systems. Just so you can understand how that works on the computer, if I re-roll the dice, you can see the numbers change. In this case, my attack strength was higher, so I've done 2 stamina points of damage against the enemy. That's how it works in Fighting Fantasy. It's very, very simple system, and certainly in later books, in fact even by the second book, they started to tweak the system a little and make it a little bit more interesting, a little bit more complex. But it's a useful structure for the purposes of what I'm trying to do here, which is to demonstrate how Elite can be brought into the game books. So the first thing I could do is to take these attributes that you have for the players and simply rename them. It's not very clever, but I could do that. So marksmanship is the new skill, hull strength is the new stamina. So the better you are at shooting your lasers, your marksmanship skill, the more chance you've got of hitting them. If you do hit them, you're going to hurt the hull. Here you can see I've damaged the enemy for 2 hull points of damage. There's nothing clever about that, it's simply the Fighting Fantasy system renamed. The beauty of setting this in the Elite Dangerous universe is that I've got the wealth of things that David Braben and Ian Bell created. So I'll have different ship types which could have different hull strengths, but most importantly for making interest within a combat system is the equipment which they've introduced. So very quickly in Frontier you can see that there's an absolute wealth of equipment, from different laser types to missiles to defense systems to different combat systems. If I was to try to introduce all of these into Survivor, combat would get very, very, very complicated. But what I really do want to do is to bring some elements of these into the combat system, because that will take me part of the way to making this feel like an Elite Dangerous gamebook as opposed to any other gamebook. So the first thing that I can introduce is guns, and I will be introducing guns in some way that I think is a bit of a no-brainer. So within Fighting Fantasy, every time you hit the enemy, you do 2 units of damage against them. Now it seems to be quite straightforward to me to say that since one of the differentiating factors you have on weapons is the strength of it, in this case what I've done is to equip myself with a weapon that does 2 megawatts of damage, and for my opponent a weapon that does 1 megawatt of damage. So you can see here I've damaged the enemy for 2 hull points of damage because I've got a 2 megawatt weapon. If I roll the dice a few more times, the enemy now attacks me. When he hits me, he only damages me for 1 point because he's got a weaker weapon than me. Still straightforward, a little bit more interesting than the basic combat system, and introducing the first of the elements that exist within Elite Dangerous. The second element that exists within Frontier is the different weapon types that you've got. So here you have a 1 megawatt pulse laser. A bit further down you've got a 5 megawatt pulse laser, so this is one that does that more damage. You can see that should do 5 points of damage instead of 1. Then if I scroll down a bit further, where is it? Here we've got a beam laser. There's other sorts of weapons, and Frontier developments have already indicated that there's complete different types like projectiles and lasers in Elite Dangerous. I'll try to introduce as many of those as I can into this combat sequence or combat system, but let's look at how I could introduce pulse lasers and beam lasers just as an example. So here I've got exactly the same scenario that I had before, except now I've got a pulse laser, my enemy's got a beam laser. It seems to me quite sensible that a beam laser is going to be easier to hit the enemy with, and in the context of this, easier means attack strength needs to be higher. So for my enemy, what I've done is to simply done a +2 bonus for the use of a beam laser when calculating the attack strength. So you take the marksmanship score, you add the dice scores, you add 2 points bonus for beam lasers, and now he has a better chance of hitting me than I had before. And indeed, it's that +2 points is actually quite a significant advantage. If I roll the dice now, the enemy is hitting me much more often than he was before. So now I've introduced weapon strength and weapon type. You'll notice that so far all I'm doing is damaging the hull. We probably all know that within the Elite universe you have shields. You don't simply damage the hull directly. So how could I introduce shields into combat? This seems quite straightforward to me, which is that whenever one opponent hits the other opponent, first of all they will damage the shields, and then when the shields get down to 0, then they'll start doing damage to the hull itself. So in this case, I've got shields left. I've got 40 units of shields. My opponent has only got, well, in fact he's got no shields left at all. So this means that if I hit my enemy, I'm going to start hitting its hull. If he hits me, first of all he's got to get through my shields. So the enemy has done some damage against my shields, and then if I roll the dice again, this time I've hit the enemy, but now I've done hull points of damage. Again, I'm pretty sure that I will have shields in the combat sequence in Survivor in some way. I don't know if it'll be exactly this way, but it makes sense to do that. That's part of Elite. Now let's move away from the equipment a little bit and look at how combat actually works in Elite. In dogfights within Elite, you can see that it feels to me that, because obviously I'm just looking at the videos at the moment, that an actual player who's flying one of those ships, some of those players will be better at targeting the enemy, at shooting, at attacking, and some other players will be better at dodging, evading, and so forth. So if I can, I'd like to try to bring that sort of thing into the fighting sequence, and give you as the player not a single score, which is marksmanship, but potentially 2 different scores. Marksmanship here, which is my ability to hit you, and piloting, which could be my ability to avoid the attacks that you're doing. So in all of the options which I've had so far, I've simply compared your attack strength against the enemy's attack strength, and whichever is higher, I've done the damage to them. But now here, I've made that rather more complicated, and say my attack strength as the player It's going to be compared against the enemy's piloting skill, and I hit the enemy if my attack strength is higher than the piloting skill, and then the opposite is true if the enemy is attacking me. So if the enemy's marksmanship plus the dice rolls plus the weapon bonus, if there is one, is greater than my piloting skill, the enemy will do damage against me. Now, this is quite a big change from fighting fantasy. If I start to introduce two different lines here, and indeed it's quite different from many of the gamebook series, in that in one single attack round, both fighters can hurt the other. I need to decide whether or not I want to do that, or whether I want to have the more common gamebook feature, which is only one person can attack the other in the gamebook. This is the most important key difference to the gamebook side, which isn't anything to do with Elite, because of the different game mechanics that you've got there. However, in this case, what you can see is that I have done 2 hull points of damage against the enemy because my attack skill has been higher than their piloting skill. Very quickly, it looks like the side isn't quite working, but I don't want to re-record the video at this point because I've been talking for quite some time. But that starts making it quite interesting if I have those 2 different skills. And I could, at the start of the book, have you specialise in either marksmanship or piloting, so you could choose which one of those skills you wanted to have the greater points in. You can see that this is already a lot more complicated than the original Fighting Fantasy battle structure. There's a lot more going on the page. The final thing which I'd like to consider when it comes to bringing Elite into the gamebook is fore and aft shields. Fore and aft shields existed in Elite, but they didn't exist in Frontier. I suspect from the videos that we've seen so far that fore and aft shields are going to exist in Elite Dangerous. This is just a guess, but it's based on some of the hints that I think David Braven's already given us. So, how could this work? Now it gets a bit more complicated again now. So here, instead of having single shields, I've got aft shield and fore shields, and then an aft weapon and fore weapon. And I've suggested that you are facing one particular way. So this is the part of your ship that's facing towards the enemy. So if the front of the ship's facing towards the enemy, obviously you can use your fore weapon, and you'll be using your fore shields, so that's what the enemy can hit. If for some reason you are facing away from the enemy, you'll be using your rear shields and your rear shields, and they'll be doing the same. This starts introducing more of a tactical element into the game. So do you want to use your front or your back? It's getting to the point of complexity where you'd be better off playing a video game than you would doing it on paper, because it's getting to that point which I said earlier on. You're fighting the system rather than fighting the enemy itself. But it could introduce some good tactical stuff. So what I don't want to do is to actually have you manoeuvring too much, or trying to get you to maneuver too much within the game book, because that's just daft. That's too complicated. But I could have something which simply says whichever player's piloting score is greater. If your piloting score is greater than your enemy's, you can choose whether you want to be facing him or running away from him. And if the enemy's shields fell too low, he might choose to escape, which would be something which you rarely see in game books. And so then his aft shields would start coming into play, and you'd have to chase after him. It could work, but I need to make sure that it's not going to get too complicated. And you can see that if you don't actually have an aft weapon, then if he's running away, he can't even shoot back, and so on and so on and so on. So that's just a quick overview for the sorts of elements of Elite that I could be bringing into combat into the game. I'm already a little bit nervous about that structure, because that already starts looking too complicated, unless it's actually fun to play. And that's where the beauty of combat in the Survivor gamebook is really going to come in, because it could be an awful lot of fun. Anyway, that's all I've got to say. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. Please do talk about it in the comment section and what you said. This is probably going to be the first video that's going to spark any sort of discussion. I'd love to hear what you think. Goodbye for now. Talk to you tomorrow. Goodbye.